Friedrich Nietzsche remains one of the most influential and controversial thinkers of modern times. His impact on philosophy, literature, psychology, and even political thought has been profound, shaping the way contemporary society grapples with existential questions, morality, and cultural critique. Nietzsche was not merely a philosopher. He was a radical critic of the prevailing ideologies of his time, challenging the foundations of religion, morality, and conventional wisdom with a fervor that continues to resonate today. His ideas, often provocative and unsettling, forced the West to reconsider its deeply held beliefs, earning him both admiration and infamy in equal measure. The phrase "warning the West" is particularly relevant when discussing Nietzsche's work. He foresaw the consequences of the decline of religious faith and the rise of nihilism, where traditional values would lose their grounding, leading to a crisis of meaning. His declaration that God is dead was not a celebration of atheism but a stark warning about the moral and existential vacuum that would follow. Nietzsche urged society to create new values, to forge meaning in a world where old certainties had crumbled. His vision of the Übermensch was one such attempt to offer a way forward, a call for individuals to transcend mediocrity and create their own purpose. Nietzsche's relevance today cannot be overstated. In an age marked by ideological conflicts, political upheaval, and a growing sense of existential despair, his insights into power, morality, and the human condition remain strikingly pertinent. His critiques of herd mentality, blind conformity, and the dangers of moral absolutism continue to provide valuable tools for understanding modern cultural and philosophical dilemmas. Whether one agrees with him or not, Nietzsche's thoughts challenge us to think deeply about the structures that govern our beliefs and actions, ensuring his legacy as a radical thinker endures. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the small village of Rocken, located in the Prussian province of Saxony. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran minister, and his mother, Franziska, came from a devoutly religious family. This deeply Christian upbringing would later serve as a crucial point of contention in Nietzsche's intellectual journey. His father's untimely death in 1849, when Friedrich was just 5 years old, cast a shadow over his childhood, leaving him to be raised predominantly by his mother, grandmother, and 2 aunts in a household dominated by religious sentiment and strict moral values. Despite this religious environment, Nietzsche's intellectual curiosity led him beyond the confines of Christian dogma at an early age. He displayed an exceptional aptitude for language, philosophy, and music, demonstrating his prodigious intellect as a young boy. As he progressed through school, he was particularly drawn to classical literature and philosophy, developing a keen appreciation for the works of the ancient Greeks. His precocious nature earned him the nickname "the Little Pastor," though it soon became evident that his path would diverge sharply from religious tradition. In 1858, Nietzsche enrolled at the prestigious Pforta school, where he excelled in classical studies. Here he was introduced to the philosophical works that would shape his later thinking, including those of Arthur Schopenhauer, whose pessimistic outlook left a deep impression on the young philosopher. It was also during this period that Nietzsche began composing music, a passion that he would carry with him throughout his life. By the time he entered the University of Bonn in 1864, Nietzsche had already begun questioning many of the religious and moral assumptions that had governed his upbringing. Nietzsche's academic career was nothing short of extraordinary. After transferring to the University of Leipzig in 1865, he quickly distinguished himself as a brilliant philologist. His encounter with Schopenhauer's "The World as Will and Representation" proved to be a pivotal moment, reinforcing his belief in the power of individual will and the tragic nature of existence. Under the guidance of renowned classicist Friedrich Nietzsche, Nietzsche's scholarly abilities flourished, earning him widespread recognition in academic circles. In an unprecedented achievement, Nietzsche was offered a professorship at the University of Basel in 1869 at the age of just 24, an appointment made despite his lack of a doctoral degree. As a professor of classical philology, he was deeply engaged in the study of ancient texts, particularly those of the pre-Socratic philosophers, whose ideas would influence his own rejection of metaphysical idealism. However, his tenure at Basel was not without difficulties. While he was respected for his intellect, his unconventional ideas and iconoclastic tendencies made him a controversial figure within academic circles. Nietzsche's intellectual journey during this time was also shaped by his engagement with Richard Wagner, the German composer whose grand vision for art and philosophy initially inspired Nietzsche. The two shared a deep admiration for Schopenhauer and saw the potential for art to serve as a transformative force in society. However, Nietzsche's eventual disillusionment with Wagner, whom he came to see as a reactionary and nationalist figure, marked a turning point in his philosophical outlook. By the mid-1870s, Nietzsche had begun distancing himself from both Wagner and the academic establishment, paving the way for his radical rethinking of philosophy. Nietzsche's physical health was a lifelong struggle, and it played a significant role in shaping his intellectual development. Throughout his academic career, he suffered from debilitating migraines, severe eye pain, and other chronic ailments that made it increasingly difficult for him to maintain his teaching duties. By 1879, his health had deteriorated to the point where he was forced to resign from his position at Basel, effectively marking the beginning of his self-imposed exile. With no fixed home, Nietzsche adopted a nomadic lifestyle, spending time in various European cities and towns, including Sils Maria in Switzerland, Genoa in Italy, and Nice in France. This period of solitude allowed him the freedom to focus entirely on his writing, leading to some of his most profound philosophical works. It was during this time that he developed many of his most famous ideas, including the concept of the will to power, the critique of morality, and the vision of the Übermensch. Despite his intellectual productivity, Nietzsche's personal life was marked by isolation and loneliness. His relationships with friends and colleagues became increasingly strained, particularly with Wagner, whose growing alignment with German nationalism Nietzsche found repugnant. Their falling out was emblematic of Nietzsche's broader rejection of the cultural and political trends of his time, as he sought to carve out an independent intellectual path. By the late 1880s, Nietzsche's health had worsened further, and his mental state began to deteriorate. In January 1889 he suffered a complete psychological breakdown in Turin, an event that effectively ended his career as a philosopher. He spent the final years of his life in a state of mental and physical decline, cared for by his family until his death in 1900. Despite his tragic end, Nietzsche's influence only grew in the years that followed, as his ideas found new relevance in the changing landscape of modern thought. What Nietzsche meant by God is dead. One of Nietzsche's most famous and provocative statements, "God is dead," appears in The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. However, Nietzsche was not making a literal theological claim but rather a cultural and existential observation. By declaring the death of God, he meant that traditional religious faith, particularly Christianity, had lost its power to provide meaning in a rapidly changing world. The Enlightenment, scientific progress, and secularization had eroded religious beliefs, leaving a vacuum in moral and existential foundations. Nietzsche's claim was not triumphant but deeply concerned. He foresaw a crisis where humanity, unmoored from divine authority, would struggle to find new values. Nietzsche was writing during a time of immense transformation. The 19th century saw the rise of rationalism, Darwinian evolution, and industrialization, all of which undermined religious certainty. For centuries, Christianity had provided a moral structure and existential security, but now, skepticism and scientific materialism threatened its dominance. Nietzsche recognized that without God, morality would no longer be grounded in divine authority, leading to uncertainty, existential anxiety, and ultimately nihilism. Nietzsche warned that if society failed to replace religious values with new life-affirming principles, it would fall into nihilism, the belief that life is meaningless. He saw the danger of people either clinging to outdated religious beliefs out of fear or succumbing to despair. Nietzsche's response to this crisis was not to advocate for a return to religion but to encourage the creation of new values, ones that celebrated life, strength, and creativity rather than submission and guilt. This laid the groundwork for his later ideas about the Übermensch and the revaluation of values. The will to power. For Nietzsche, the fundamental force behind all human actions is the will to power, will zur Macht. He rejected traditional notions that humans are primarily driven by survival, pleasure, or reason. Instead, he argued that everything we do, whether in art, politics, philosophy, or daily life, is an expression of our inherent desire to assert power, overcome obstacles, and shape the world. The will to power is not merely domination over others but a creative force that drives individuals to transcend themselves and achieve greatness. Traditional morality, especially Christian morality, often promotes self-denial, humility, and meekness. Nietzsche saw this as a distortion of human nature, a way for the weak to suppress the strong. He argued that conventional moral systems were often tools of the powerless to impose limitations on the powerful, turning natural instincts into sins. Instead of accepting inherited moral codes, Nietzsche believed individuals should forge their own values based on strength, creativity, and self-overcoming. History, for Nietzsche, is not shaped by rational progress or divine will but by the struggle of competing forces of power. Civilizations rise and fall based on their vitality and their ability to assert themselves. He saw figures like Napoleon, Caesar, and great artists and thinkers as manifestations of the will to power, people who reshaped the world according to their vision. In contrast, societies that suppress this drive become stagnant and decadent, leading to cultural decline. Slave morality versus master morality. On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche contrasts two types of morality: master morality and slave morality. Master morality originates from strong, self-assertive individuals who define good in terms of strength, nobility, and vitality. It values courage, ambition, and self-expression. In contrast, slave morality arises among the weak, who resent the power of the strong and redefine good as humility, obedience, and suffering. Christianity, according to Nietzsche, played a significant role in promoting slave morality. By glorifying meekness, turning the other cheek, and condemning power, it inverted natural human values. In his view, the early Christians who were persecuted and powerless redefined morality in a way that benefited them, making virtues out of weakness and vices out of strength. A key concept in Nietzsche's analysis is ressentiment, a deep-seated resentment harbored by the powerless against those who are strong and successful. Instead of striving for power themselves, those who adopt slave morality seek to bring down their betters. This leads to moral systems that condemn ambition, wealth, and personal excellence, favoring guilt, self-sacrifice, and conformity instead. Nietzsche argued that much of modern Western morality still operates under the influence of slave morality. Democratic ideals, socialism, and religious ethics often promote equality at the expense of excellence. While he did not advocate for oppression, he believed that the suppression of strength and individuality leads to mediocrity. The challenge, then, is to rise above this inherited morality and embrace values that affirm life and human potential. The Übermensch. The concept of the Übermensch, Overman or Superman, is one of Nietzsche's most famous and misunderstood ideas. Introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Übermensch is the individual who has transcended conventional morality, overcome nihilism, and created his own values. He is not bound by religious or societal dogma but forges a path based on strength, creativity, and self-overcoming. Nietzsche saw the Übermensch as the solution to the crisis of meaning left by the death of God. Without religious or absolute moral foundations, individuals must take responsibility for shaping their own values. The Übermensch embraces life fully, affirming both its joys and its sufferings, rather than retreating into escapism or despair. Many have misinterpreted the Übermensch as a justification for tyranny or elitism, but Nietzsche was not advocating for a race of superhumans or ruthless dictators. Instead, the Übermensch represents an aspirational ideal, someone who lives authentically and creatively beyond societal constraints. His ideas were later misused by ideologies such as Nazism, which twisted his philosophy into something Nietzsche himself would have condemned. Eternal recurrence. Eternal recurrence is one of Nietzsche's most intriguing and challenging ideas. He asks us to imagine living our lives over and over again, exactly as they are, for eternity. This thought experiment forces individuals to confront the way they live. Would you embrace your life if you had to relive it forever, or would you despair? Nietzsche's idea is not meant to be a literal cosmological claim but a test of one's attitude toward life. If you would be horrified by the idea of reliving your existence eternally, then you are not living authentically. The goal is to live in such a way that you would gladly embrace eternal recurrence, fully affirming life in all its struggles and triumphs. Eternal recurrence stands in stark contrast to religious notions of an afterlife or divine judgment. Rather than seeking redemption or ultimate justice in another world, Nietzsche urges us to find meaning in this life. This is a radical shift, as it eliminates the hope for external salvation and places the burden of meaning-making entirely on the individual. The danger of herd mentality. Nietzsche was deeply skeptical of democracy, seeing it as a system that fosters mediocrity rather than excellence. While democratic ideals promote equality, Nietzsche believed they also suppress the potential for greatness by encouraging conformity and collective thinking. He argued that democracy, by its very nature, prioritizes the needs of the majority, what he called the herd, over the flourishing of exceptional individuals. Mass culture, fueled by media, entertainment, and societal norms, further reinforces herd mentality. In Nietzsche's view, the more society embraces uniformity, the harder it becomes for individuals to break free from conventional thought and carve out their own values. He feared that the rise of democracy and mass culture would lead to a society that discourages independent thinking and the pursuit of greatness, replacing it with comfort, complacency, and mediocrity. Nietzsche's contempt for mediocrity was tied to his broader philosophy of self-overcoming. He saw mass culture as a force that seduces individuals into passive existence, where people seek security, pleasure, and convenience rather than striving for higher achievements. Instead of pursuing excellence, individuals are taught to conform, follow social norms, and avoid risk. This ties into his criticism of morality, particularly Christian and modern moralities, which emphasize humility, obedience, and self-sacrifice. Such values, Nietzsche argued, encourage individuals to suppress their instincts and ambitions in favor of collective harmony. He believed that greatness arises not from conformity but from struggle, risk, and the will to power. Nietzsche's critique is even more relevant today, where social media, consumer culture, and political correctness reinforce herd mentality. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and mainstream media shape public opinion in ways that discourage dissent and critical thought. Instead of striving for personal greatness, many people seek validation through likes, shares, and collective approval. Nietzsche foresaw the dangers of a world where people are afraid to challenge dominant narratives, where individuality is sacrificed for group identity, and where excellence is frowned upon because it makes others feel inadequate. His call to resist the herd and cultivate one's unique potential remains one of his most urgent and enduring messages. The rise of nihilism. Nietzsche viewed the decline of religious belief and traditional values as both inevitable and dangerous. With the death of God, the West lost the foundation that had provided meaning and moral guidance for centuries. However, rather than immediately replacing these values with something new, society drifted into a state of uncertainty. Without a higher purpose, people risked falling into nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning. Nietzsche saw nihilism as the great crisis of Western civilization. He believed that the West, having lost faith in religious dogma, had yet to find a new framework to replace it. The result was cultural decay, stagnation, and a loss of confidence in life itself. He feared that if society failed to develop new values, it would succumb to despair, hedonism, or blind adherence to new dogmas that were just as restrictive as the old ones. Nietzsche argued that human beings crave meaning. For centuries, Christianity provided that meaning by offering a sense of purpose, moral order, and the promise of an afterlife. With the collapse of religious belief, individuals were left adrift, searching for new sources of meaning in a world that seemed indifferent to their existence. This led to what Nietzsche called the greatest danger, a passive, resigned nihilism where people accept life as meaningless but do nothing to change it. Many people, he feared, would turn to distractions, pleasure, entertainment, consumerism, or political ideologies to avoid confronting the void. Others might adopt secular dogmas such as nationalism or socialism as substitutes for religious faith. Nietzsche distinguished between active nihilism and passive nihilism. Passive nihilism is the resignation to meaninglessness, leading to apathy, depression, and conformity. In contrast, active nihilism is the destruction of outdated values in order to create new, life-affirming ones. Nietzsche saw passive nihilism as a grave threat, one that would lead to a society of weak-willed individuals who sought comfort and distraction instead of striving for greatness. To overcome nihilism, Nietzsche believed that individuals must consciously create their own values. This is where his concept of the Übermensch comes in, an individual who does not succumb to despair but instead forges a new path, embracing life's struggles and shaping meaning from within. Today, Nietzsche's warning about nihilism remains strikingly relevant. The modern world, with its emphasis on material success, endless entertainment, and shallow pleasures, often serves as an escape from deeper existential questions. Nietzsche's challenge to us is to confront these realities head-on and to take responsibility for our own meaning-making. Modernity and its discontents. Nietzsche was not opposed to science or rationalism, but he recognized their unintended consequences. The rise of science and rational thought had discredited many religious explanations, but in doing so, they also eroded the deeper existential and moral frameworks that religion had provided. Nietzsche feared that the modern emphasis on scientific objectivity, while valuable, could lead to a cold, mechanistic view of the world. Without deeper meaning, human life might be reduced to mere biological processes, governed by impersonal forces rather than purpose or destiny. This, in turn, could fuel nihilism, as people would no longer see themselves as part of a grand narrative but merely as accidents of evolution. Nietzsche anticipated the dangers of unchecked technological and economic progress. He saw that modern industrial societies, driven by efficiency and productivity, often strip life of its richness. The relentless pursuit of convenience and pleasure leaves little room for struggle, growth, or self-overcoming. In a world where everything is designed to be easier, safer, and more accessible, Nietzsche feared that people would become weaker, physically, mentally, and spiritually. The elimination of hardship and suffering might seem desirable, but Nietzsche saw struggle as essential for human greatness. Without obstacles to overcome, individuals risk becoming passive consumers rather than active creators. Modern technology, from artificial intelligence to social media, amplifies these concerns. Today's world encourages passive consumption, binge-watching, endless scrolling, and algorithm-driven content, all of which foster distraction rather than deep engagement. Nietzsche's warning about the dangers of comfort culture is more relevant than ever. Nietzsche was critical of both socialism and nationalism, seeing them as new forms of herd mentality that replaced religious faith with secular dogmas. He viewed socialism as an extension of slave morality, an ideology that prioritizes equality and collective welfare at the expense of individual greatness. While he was also critical of capitalism, he feared that socialism would suppress the natural hierarchy that allows great individuals to emerge. Similarly, Nietzsche criticized nationalism, seeing it as another form of mass conformity. He rejected the idea that identity should be rooted in national or racial categories, instead emphasizing personal excellence over collective belonging. His critique of political ideologies was based on the belief that they often serve as substitutes for religion, offering simple answers and moral certainty to those unwilling to think for themselves. In today's polarized world, Nietzsche's warnings ring true. Many modern movements, whether political, ideological, or social, operate with a rigid moral framework that discourages independent thought. Nietzsche's challenge remains the same: to resist the comfort of easy answers and to embrace the struggle of forging one's own path. In his final productive years, Nietzsche wrote some of his most radical and provocative works. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883–1885, was perhaps his most ambitious and poetic work, blending philosophy, allegory, and religious symbolism. Presented as a series of sermons by the fictional prophet Zarathustra, the book explored key Nietzschean ideas such as the Übermensch, the death of God, and eternal recurrence. It was written in a highly literary and almost biblical style, making it different from his earlier, more structured works. Though Nietzsche considered it his masterpiece, it was initially misunderstood and received little recognition during his lifetime. Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, was a more structured and critical work, expanding on the themes of Zarathustra but with a sharper attack on conventional morality, religion, and philosophy. Nietzsche argued that Western moral traditions, particularly those derived from Christianity, were built on weakness, resentment, and fear rather than strength, creativity, and affirmation of life. He proposed that morality should not be based on universal principles but on the will to power and the ability of individuals to create their own values. In The Antichrist, 1888, Nietzsche's critique of Christianity reached its peak. He viewed Christianity as the ultimate manifestation of slave morality, a system designed to suppress the strong and elevate the weak through guilt, self-denial, and fear. He saw Jesus as a misunderstood figure whose teachings were later corrupted by institutions like the Church. Nietzsche's condemnation of Christianity in this work was among his most extreme, leading to its suppression upon publication. As Nietzsche's health declined and his ideas became more extreme, his writing took on a prophetic and urgent tone. He saw himself as a philosopher of the future, someone whose ideas would only be understood by later generations. In his personal letters he referred to himself as a destiny, and occasionally signed his name as Dionysus, or the Crucified, reflecting his growing identification with mythic and religious figures. His later works, especially Ecce Homo, 1888, reveal an almost messianic self-image. This autobiographical work was filled with grandiose statements such as, "I am not a man, I am dynamite," and, "One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous." While some see this as evidence of his impending mental collapse, others argue that Nietzsche was deliberately adopting an exaggerated style to make a point about his philosophical mission. Nietzsche believed that his time had not yet come. His philosophy was revolutionary, challenging centuries of religious and moral traditions, and he knew that most of his contemporaries would not accept it. He struggled with feelings of isolation and frustration, recognizing that he was ahead of his time. His books did not sell well and his ideas were widely dismissed or misunderstood. Even his admirers, such as Danish critic George Brandes, who first introduced Nietzsche's philosophy to the public, struggled to fully grasp the implications of his thought. In letters to friends, Nietzsche lamented his lack of recognition and saw himself as a lone thinker pushing against the tide of history. Despite his sense of alienation, Nietzsche remained intellectually productive up until his mental collapse. His final year of writing in 1888 produced some of his most powerful works, including The Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist, but also some of his most erratic letters and declarations. His descent into madness came swiftly and dramatically, marking the tragic end of his philosophical journey. On January 3, 1889, Nietzsche suffered a complete mental breakdown while living in Turin, Italy. According to a well-known but possibly apocryphal story, he witnessed a horse being beaten in the street, ran to embrace it and then collapsed, weeping. This moment has often been romanticized as a symbol of Nietzsche's compassion or his final break from reality, but it remains unclear whether this specific event triggered his collapse or was merely the most visible sign of his deteriorating mental state. In the days leading up to his breakdown, Nietzsche had been writing increasingly erratic letters, now known as the Madness Letters. These letters, addressed to figures such as Kaiser Wilhelm II and Cosima Wagner, contained grandiose claims. Nietzsche declared himself to be the new ruler of the world, the successor of Christ and the god Dionysus. His behavior became so alarming that his friends and family were forced to intervene. Shortly after the incident in Turin, Nietzsche was placed under medical supervision and later taken to a psychiatric clinic in Basel, Switzerland. He never recovered his sanity. The exact cause of Nietzsche's madness remains a subject of debate among historians and medical experts. The most commonly cited explanation is tertiary syphilis, a late-stage form of the disease that affects the brain and nervous system. This diagnosis was given by doctors at the time, who noted symptoms consistent with neurosyphilis, including paranoia, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. However, some modern scholars challenge this theory, suggesting alternative explanations such as a hereditary brain disorder. Nietzsche's father died of a brain-related illness, possibly indicating a genetic condition such as a slow-progressing form of dementia, a tumor or stroke. Some researchers believe Nietzsche may have suffered from a brain tumor or vascular disease, which could explain his gradual cognitive deterioration. A bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, his extreme mood swings, grandiose delusions, and increasing detachment from reality could be interpreted as symptoms of severe psychiatric illness. Regardless of the medical cause, Nietzsche's collapse marked the end of his intellectual life. For the remaining 11 years of his life, Nietzsche lived in a near catatonic state, first in clinics and later under the care of his mother and sister. In the early years after his breakdown, he occasionally showed signs of lucidity, but over time he became almost completely unresponsive. He could no longer write or engage in meaningful conversation, and his once sharp mind faded into silence. His mother, Franziska Nietzsche, took care of him until her death in 1897. Afterward, his sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, took control of his care, and, more controversially, his legacy. Elisabeth was an ardent nationalist and anti-Semite, and she manipulated Nietzsche's writings to align with her own views. She later became close to Adolf Hitler and played a major role in the misrepresentation of Nietzsche as a proto-fascist thinker. Nietzsche spent his last years in a vegetative state, often staring blankly for hours. Occasionally he would play the piano or mumble a few incoherent words, but he never regained his mental faculties. On August 25, 1900, he died of pneumonia and complications from his prolonged illness. Nietzsche's final years are among the most tragic in the history of philosophy. A man who spent his life fighting against mediocrity, herd mentality, and intellectual stagnation was ultimately reduced to a shadow of himself. Yet, despite his descent into madness, his ideas lived on, growing in influence long after his death. Today, Nietzsche is recognized as one of the most revolutionary thinkers in Western philosophy. His critiques of morality, religion, and modernity continue to shape contemporary thought, proving that in many ways he was correct. He was a philosopher whose time had not yet come. One of the most damaging misinterpretations of Nietzsche's philosophy came from his own sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche. After Nietzsche's mental collapse in 1889, Elisabeth became the gatekeeper of his unpublished works and manuscripts. A fervent nationalist and anti-Semite, she sought to align Nietzsche's ideas with far-right political movements, including the emerging ideologies of German nationalism and fascism. Elisabeth had already been involved in reactionary politics. She and her husband, Bernhard Forster, had attempted to establish a utopian Aryan colony in Paraguay, called Nueva Germania, based on racist and anti-Semitic principles. The colony failed, but Elisabeth returned to Germany, determined to shape her brother's legacy according to her views. She edited and recompiled Nietzsche's unpublished works, most notoriously in The Will to Power, 1901, a book that Nietzsche himself never wrote in its final form. She deliberately removed Nietzsche's criticisms of nationalism and anti-Semitism, giving the impression that he supported authoritarianism and racial superiority. Elizabeth also played a significant role in forging connections between Nietzsche's philosophy and the Nazi regime. She invited Adolf Hitler to visit the Nietzsche archive in Weimar, where Hitler was famously photographed gazing at a bust of Nietzsche. She also gifted Hitler a personal copy of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, reinforcing the illusion that Nietzsche was a proto-fascist thinker. One of the greatest distortions of Nietzsche's ideas was the Nazi interpretation of the Übermensch, Overman/Superman. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche presents the Übermensch as an individual who has transcended conventional morality, creating new values and embracing life fully. The Übermensch is not defined by racial superiority but by intellectual and existential transformation. However, Nazi ideologues twisted this concept into a justification for their belief in an Aryan master race. They falsely equated the Übermensch with biological supremacy, warlike dominance, and racial purity, ideas that Nietzsche explicitly rejected. In reality, Nietzsche despised nationalism, collectivism, and blind obedience to the state. His Übermensch was not a soldier or dictator but an artist, philosopher, or visionary who broke free from societal constraints. Far from being a proto-Nazi, Nietzsche was a staunch critic of nationalism, German militarism, and anti-Semitism. He had deep contempt for figures like Otto von Bismarck, whose unification of Germany he saw as fostering herd mentality and state control. He called nationalism a form of collective mediocrity that crushed individual greatness. Similarly, Nietzsche rejected anti-Semitism outright. He broke ties with Richard Wagner, once his greatest intellectual companion, because Wagner became increasingly nationalistic and anti-Semitic. In letters, Nietzsche ridiculed German anti-Semites as resentful and small-minded, and saw Jews as a historically resilient and admirable people. His warnings against mass conformity, ideological fanaticism, and blind obedience were ironically ignored by those who sought to use his philosophy for totalitarian purposes. Nietzsche is often considered a precursor to existentialism, influencing major 20th-century philosophers like Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Albert Camus. His concept of the death of God forced thinkers to grapple with the problem of meaning in a world without divine moral order. Heidegger saw Nietzsche as the culmination of Western metaphysics, interpreting his work as a confrontation with nihilism. Sartre built on Nietzsche's idea that values are not given but must be created through radical freedom and personal responsibility. Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, engaged with Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, proposing that the only way to live authentically is to embrace life's absurdity without despair. These thinkers did not always agree with Nietzsche, but his ideas formed the foundation of modern existential thought. Nietzsche's insights into the unconscious, repression, and human drives had a profound impact on Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Freud saw Nietzsche's concept of the will to power as an early articulation of repressed desires and the id. He also echoed Nietzsche's critique of morality as a form of psychological repression. Jung admired Nietzsche's depth but saw his struggle with nihilism as unresolved. Jung's idea of individuation, the integration of the unconscious and conscious self, shares parallels with Nietzsche's Übermensch as a higher state of self-overcoming. In many ways, Nietzsche anticipated modern psychoanalysis, even though he never developed a structured psychological theory. Nietzsche's attack on absolute truths made him a central figure in postmodern philosophy. Thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Gilles Deleuze expanded on his critique of language, power, and truth. Foucault used Nietzsche's genealogy method to deconstruct history, showing how power shapes knowledge. Derrida's deconstruction owes much to Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics and the idea that meaning is fluid rather than fixed. Deleuze viewed Nietzsche as a philosopher of affirmation and creativity, rejecting static structures in favor of life's dynamism. While postmodernists took Nietzsche in new directions, his critique of truth and morality remains central to contemporary debates. Nietzsche foresaw a world struggling with meaning after the decline of religious belief. Today, this crisis is evident in rising depression, existential anxiety, and cultural fragmentation. Without shared values, societies drift into moral relativism or ideological extremism. The rise of consumerism echoes Nietzsche's fear of nihilism turning into passive hedonism. Political polarization mirrors his warning about ideology replacing authentic thinking. Technological distractions numb people from confronting existential questions. Nietzsche warned against nihilism, but not all forms of nihilism are the same. Passive nihilism leads to apathy, resignation, and withdrawal from life, whereas active nihilism destroys old values to create new meaning. Today, many people escape nihilism through fanaticism, whether in politics, religion, or digital culture. Nietzsche would likely argue that the only solution is self-overcoming, creating meaning rather than seeking it externally. Nietzsche would likely criticize modern culture for its obsession with comfort, victimhood, and herd mentality. He would see social media as an extension of herd morality, where people seek validation rather than truth. He would mock identity politics, believing it fosters resentment rather than self-transcendence. He would argue that true freedom requires accepting life's struggles rather than avoiding them. Nietzsche's call to affirm life remains one of his most urgent messages today. Nietzsche's core warnings include the death of God, which marks the collapse of religious certainty and leaves a vacuum that must be filled with new values, the danger of nihilism, which without meaning risks societies falling into despair or extremism, and the weakening of the individual as democracy, mass media, and ideology threaten genuine self-overcoming. Nietzsche's relevance has never been greater. His ideas challenge us to reject passive nihilism and take responsibility for our own meaning, question ideological dogma instead of blindly following trends, and strive for personal greatness rather than comfort or conformity. Nietzsche offers no easy answers, but he urges us to become who we are, to live with intensity, courage, and creative power. His philosophy is a call to embrace life fully, despite its uncertainties. This is Nietzsche's final challenge to us.